Let me ask you something. Right now, as you watch this, is this war escalating or is it ending? Because here is what happened in the last 24 hours. The United States launched a naval blockade of Iranian ports. That is escalation. Within hours, two sanctioned ships, one linked directly to Iranian oil operations, sailed straight through the Strait of Hormuz anyway. That is the blockade failing on day one. Iran demanded financial compensation from 5 Arab states it blames for supporting the U.S. war. That is escalation. And yet Trump says Iran called his administration this morning to say they want to make a deal very badly. Second in-person talks could happen within 48 hours. Turkey is actively working to bridge the gap. That is de-escalation. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., something happened today that nobody alive has seen before. Israeli and Lebanese diplomats sat down together in the same room for the first formal direct negotiations in 40 years in Washington. Under American supervision, while Hezbollah rockets are still hitting northern Israel, while Israeli jets are still hitting southern Lebanon, while the ceasefire that is supposed to cover Lebanon is simultaneously being honored and violated depending on who you ask. This series of contradictions has rapidly evolved into the most complex, simultaneous, multi-track diplomatic and military situation in modern history. Every signal points in a different direction at the same time. And understanding which signal is real, which move is genuine, and which is theater could mean the difference between the end of this war and its most destructive phase yet. What happens next could fundamentally change everything, and the world is not ready for what's coming in either direction. Welcome. Today's briefing is called Operation Double Game, because that is exactly what every major player in this conflict is running right now. The U.S. is blockading and negotiating simultaneously. Iran is calling for compensation and calling for a deal simultaneously. Israel is bombing Lebanon and sitting down for peace talks with Lebanon simultaneously. And the ceasefire that was supposed to give everyone breathing room is being violated by the same parties who signed it. Everything today is sourced and verified across 15 major news outlets. 5 separate storylines are running in parallel. We untangle all of them, and we wargame the only question that matters. Which move is the real one, and which is the bluff? Let's build the picture. Per CNN's live updates and Al Jazeera's live blog, within hours of the U.S. naval blockade going live at 10 a.m. Monday, 2 sanctioned ships sailed through the Strait of Hormuz regardless. The first was the Rich Starry, a Chinese-owned vessel linked to Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping Co. Ltd., sanctioned by the United States since 2023 for involvement in Iranian petroleum transport. The second was the Elpis, sanctioned in 2025 for its role in Iran's shadow fleet, ships that turn off tracking systems to move Iranian oil in defiance of Western restrictions. Both vessels transited the strait. Neither was intercepted. Neither was, as Trump warned on Truth Social, eliminated. Per ship tracking data reviewed by CNN, little traffic was otherwise entering or leaving Iranian ports on the first full day of the blockade. But the 2 vessels that did move tell a story that the Pentagon press office would rather you didn't read too carefully. The Shadow Fleet, a network of hundreds of vessels that Iran has spent years building precisely for this scenario, is not easily blockaded. Iran has oil already loaded on ships that left before the blockade went live. Per Gregory Brew at Eurasia Group, cited in CNN's deep reporting, Iran has built enough of a financial cushion from recent oil sales, when Trump briefly lifted sanctions weeks ago, that it could withstand a blockade for a little while. The regime can likely endure economic pressure for at least the next 3 to 4 weeks before the pain gets significant. That is not a quick lever. The Shadow Fleet scenario is the story the blockade's architects hoped nobody would talk about on day one. Here is the blunt reality. Iran has spent years building a parallel maritime infrastructure specifically designed to circumvent U.S. sanctions. Hundreds of vessels, flag-switching operations, tracker blackout protocols. It was used throughout the Trump first term and the Biden years. It is being used right now. The U.S. is not blockading a traditional navy with identifiable ships. It is blockading a ghost fleet that already knows how to be invisible. Intercepting every sanctioned vessel in international waters, which is what Trump literally posted he'd instructed, would require a level of maritime enforcement that would consume half the U.S. Navy's operational resources. This blockade will hurt Iran, but it will not be the clean, total economic strangulation that the Truth Social post implied. Here's the specific detail from the Islamabad talks that most outlets buried in paragraph 14, and that is actually the entire story. Per CNN's deep reporting on the Islamabad talks, the U.S. proposed that Iran accept a 20-year moratorium on uranium enrichment. Iran counter-proposed 5 years. The U.S. rejected 5 years. Iran rejected 20. The gap between those two numbers, 15 years, is the entire reason this war is still happening. Think about what this means in practice. 15 years is not ideological. It is not theological. It is a technical timeline disagreement about how long Iran must remain non-enriching before the restriction can be re-evaluated. Under a 5-year moratorium, Iran would re-emerge as a potential nuclear-capable state by 2031, within the current generation of political leadership on both sides. Under a 20-year moratorium, that question does not re-arise until 2046, an entirely different geopolitical era. The U.S. argument is that only a generation-length commitment provides genuine security assurance. Iran's argument is that 20 years of total economic vulnerability without enrichment capability is not a concession. It is an unconditional surrender wrapped in diplomatic language. Per Araghchi's post-talk statement on X, the Iranian delegation felt they were just inches away from an Islamabad MOU when maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade arrived simultaneously. Per a senior U.S. official quoted by CNN, the U.S. perspective is precisely the opposite. The Iranians misperceived their negotiating strength and arrived in Islamabad believing they had more leverage than they actually have. Both of those statements can be simultaneously true, which is exactly why this negotiation is so extraordinarily difficult. Iran is not wrong that 20 years is an enormous ask from a country that just had its supreme leader killed, its military decimated, and its economy strangled. The U.S. is not wrong that a 5-year moratorium provides minimal real security assurance and creates a political time bomb for every subsequent administration. The 15-year gap is not bridgeable by goodwill alone. It requires a third element that neither side has put on the table yet, a verification architecture robust enough to give Washington enough confidence to accept 5 or 7 years, and a sanctions relief timeline concrete enough to give Tehran enough economic benefit to accept 15. That architecture is what Turkey, Qatar, and Oman are now racing to construct as mediators for the potential second round of talks. Per the Times of Israel, AP, and CNN, Israeli and Lebanese diplomats met in Washington on Tuesday for the first formal direct negotiations between the two countries in 40 years. This is not a ceasefire negotiation. It is something potentially more significant, a framework discussion for a peace agreement that could permanently end the Lebanon conflict that has been running, in various forms, since 1982. Lebanon's president hoped the meeting would result in a ceasefire. Hezbollah, predictably, called on Beirut to reject the talks. Netanyahu crossed into Lebanon in person on Sunday, the first Israeli prime minister to do so in decades, and said those displaced from southern Lebanon will not be allowed to return until security guarantees are in place. The conditions Israel has defined for ending the Lebanon war, per the Jerusalem Post, include complete Hezbollah disarmament, permanent IDF presence in a southern buffer zone, and Lebanon's government assuming full sovereignty and security control over its southern territories. The conditions Lebanon has set include an immediate ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. Those positions are currently incompatible, but the fact that they are being discussed in Washington with American mediation represents a geopolitical shift of enormous significance that has been completely overshadowed by the Hormuz drama. Per Anadolu Agency, Iran has formally demanded financial compensation from 5 Arab states that it blames for facilitating the U.S.-Israel war. The specific states have not been formally named in all reports, but contextual analysis points to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, all of which host U.S. military bases that were used in Operation Epic Fury. Iran's UN envoy simultaneously called the U.S. naval blockade a gross violation of Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity, per Press TV, and demanded the UN Security Council condemn what Tehran describes as piracy. Meanwhile, per the Jerusalem Post, Israel's Mossad chief vowed that efforts to achieve regime change in Iran, one of Operation Epic Fury's original stated objectives, would continue. And Israel's Defense Minister Katz defined specific conditions for an end of war with Iran that include the permanent dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, the withdrawal of all IRGC forces from Lebanon and Syria, and a comprehensive arms embargo on Hezbollah. The compensation demand and the Mossad chief's statement, read together, tell you something important about the current moment. Both sides are simultaneously pursuing war aims and peace talks. That is not necessarily contradictory. It is how most major conflict terminations work, historically. You keep the military pressure on while the diplomats talk, so that when a deal is reached, you are negotiating from maximum strength. The danger is that one of the military moves, a sanctioned ship intercepted by U.S. forces, an IRGC speedboat harassing a U.S. destroyer, a Hezbollah missile that kills Israeli civilians on the same day as Washington talks, creates an escalation that makes the diplomacy politically unsalvageable. That is the razor's edge every negotiator in this conflict is walking today. Scenario 1 is the one that the behind-the-scenes diplomatic activity is pointing toward, tentatively, cautiously, and with enormous uncertainty. The U.S. and Iran find a formula, a 10-year enrichment moratorium, perhaps with an option to review after 7 years with verified compliance, in exchange for phased sanctions relief and Hormuz reopening. The ceasefire extends beyond April 21st. A second round of talks, in Geneva or Istanbul, per the CNN source, happens within 72 hours. The nuclear numbers narrow from 20 versus 5 to something in the 8 to 12-year range that both sides can present to their domestic audiences as a victory. The blockade served its purpose, not as a physical barrier, but as a psychological pressure tool that demonstrated U.S. willingness to escalate and cost Iran its remaining toll revenue. Iran demonstrated it could withstand the blockade through its shadow fleet, proving it still has leverage. Both sides have now tested their respective asymmetric approaches to the maximum extent the ceasefire permits. And with the ceasefire deadline of April 21st approaching, 1 week from now, the incentive to reach a framework agreement before military operations resume is very real for both Washington and Tehran. Scenario 2 is the one that keeps naval commanders in the Gulf awake at night. The U.S. has told Trump that Iranian ships approaching the blockade zone will be eliminated. Trump has told the press the same. But what happens when a sanctioned vessel, like the Rich Starry, doesn't stop? Does the U.S. fire on a Chinese-linked oil tanker in international waters? Does it board it? Does it let it pass, as happened on day one? Every time a sanctioned ship transits without consequence, Iran's confidence in its shadow fleet grows, and the blockade's credibility erodes. Every time the U.S. considers firing on one, it risks an international incident with China, which has been quietly supporting Iran's oil economy throughout the war. That escalates the conflict to a third major power. Per CFR's analysis, the open for all or open for none dynamic Trump has created means that the blockade simultaneously hurts Iran and every other Gulf oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar. The nations Trump needs as allies are being economically pressured by the same blockade designed to pressure Iran. That asymmetric strain is not sustainable indefinitely. Scenario 3 is the scenario that Turkey is actively constructing. Per the CNN source, Turkey is working to bridge gaps between the U.S. and Iran ahead of a potential second round. Turkey's unique position, a NATO member with strong economic ties to Iran, deep engagement with both Russia and the Gulf states, and a historical tradition of hosting sensitive diplomacy, makes it perhaps the only country with enough credibility on all sides to present a new framework. A Turkish-mediated solution might look like this. The strait reopens under a temporary international monitoring arrangement that Iran does not frame as surrender, but rather as joint management. The nuclear moratorium is set at 8 years, with a built-in review mechanism. Sanctions are lifted in tranches, with the first tranche arriving as soon as Hormuz flows resume. This gives Trump a win on Hormuz, Vance a win on nuclear, and Iran a win on sanctions, without any side having to publicly capitulate. If you want to track every step of this diplomatic architecture as it emerges, subscribe to this channel right now. Now let's talk about the most dangerous scenario of all, April 21st. That is the date the 2-week ceasefire expires, 1 week from today. If no deal framework has been reached by then, no extension agreed, no second round of talks concluded, no nuclear moratorium accepted, the ceasefire lapses. And what comes next is not another round of the same strikes that have been running since February 28th. Per the Jerusalem Post, the Mossad chief has confirmed that regime change operations will continue. Per CNN's reporting, the Pentagon has presented Trump with military options that include renewed full-scale bombing. And Trump himself said last Sunday, if they don't give that plan up, when asked if the U.S. would continue to destruct Iran. The force projection available to the U.S. on April 22nd is, if anything, greater than it was on February 28th. Ships are reloaded, munitions restocked, mine-clearing operations have improved access to the strait, and Iran, per U.S. intelligence assessments, has had its air defenses significantly degraded, its missile inventory reduced by 80–90%, and its naval capacity decimated. The resumption of full-scale bombing would be, in military terms, hitting a significantly weaker target. The question is whether that military advantage translates into political leverage, or whether it simply deepens a conflict that nobody, including the Trump administration, has a convincing plan to end. The juice versus the squeeze. Today's edition. If the double game works, if the blockade creates just enough economic pain on Iran, and the second round of talks produces a 8-10-year nuclear framework, and Turkey bridges the gap, and the Israel-Lebanon-Washington summit produces even a preliminary framework, the world gets an off-ramp from the most destructive regional war in decades. The strait reopens, oil falls, the global economy begins healing, and the 45 days of war produce something that 47 years of sanctions never did, a fundamentally new strategic relationship between the United States and Iran. If it doesn't, if the sanctioned ships keep sailing and the blockade erodes its own credibility, if the 15-year nuclear gap proves unbridgeable, if an IRGC speedboat makes a catastrophic mistake near a U.S. destroyer, if April 21st arrives with no deal and no extension, then the war restarts from a position where both sides are more entrenched, more politically committed to their red lines, and more aware of exactly where the other side's pressure points are. The decisive moment is not tomorrow, it is April 21st. 1 week. 7 days to close a 15-year gap on a nuclear timeline, reopen the most important shipping lane on Earth, bring Lebanon and Israel to a peace framework, and convince both Tehran and Washington that the deal on the table is better than the war that resumes if there isn't one. 7 days, and the world is watching every one of them. Subscribe, share. We will cover every development, every ship, every statement, every session, until April 21st decides it for all of us.